Welcome to episode 314 of the Postal Hub podcast. I'm Ian Kerr. Heleen Buldeo Rai, Assistant Professor at VUB, joins me in a moment to discuss urban logistics and in particular her recent research on urban warehouses as good neighbours. Now, before we get to Heleen and that discussion on urban warehousing and urban logistics, a quick reminder about the 4th International Postal Retail Benchmarking Workshop coming up in September. It's a great event for anybody who's a leader in the post office or the postal retail world. Get together with all the other leaders from around the postal world who are looking at the same sorts of challenges when it comes to operating a post office network. It's going to be held from the 5th to the 7th of September in Helsinki, Finland, hosted by our good friends at Posti. Head over to thepostalhub.com/events for more details and a link to the registrations and everything like that. So coming up in just a moment, Heleen Buldeo Rai discussing urban warehouses as good neighbours. Joining me on the line is Heleen Buldeo Rai. She's Assistant Professor at VUB. Heleen, welcome back. We're going to talk about a paper you recently published, Urban Warehouses as Good Neighbours, findings from a New York City case study. And this is a really interesting idea, Heleen, the idea of urban warehouses being good neighbours. It sort of fits in with this theme we've seen over recent years of fulfillment centres and things like that getting closer to the consumer and moving from outside of metropolitan areas to somehow inside metropolitan areas. Is that sort of the trend that you're seeing in part as part of this research?
Well, yes, it's definitely a trend that we've been seeing in the last years with e-commerce facilities in all shapes and sizes actually entering the urban core. And this is something that we have seen in the last few years. But before that, what we mostly have been observing is quite the opposite. Warehouses and logistics facilities being removed ever further away from the urban core and from city centers. And it's definitely a phenomenon of proximity logistics centers coming closer to the city that has been spurred by e-commerce and also urban regulations that are coming up. So it's definitely a very recent trend, but quite strong in a lot of cities.
New York City is an interesting place in terms of things like population density and various factors like that. The price of real estate, I suppose, is another thing that makes it interesting. When you're talking about being a good neighbour in the New York context, can you just tell us a little bit about how you approached the research, how you sort of work out what is a good neighbour? And I suppose, I know I'm throwing a lot of questions at you here, but why New York as well? Is it just because it is interesting?
Yes. So there are very different reasons why New York is an interesting case study to investigate this concept of urban warehouses. One is that it's one of the cities where we've been seeing the phenomenon quite strongly in the last few years. So a lot of urban logistics facilities have been popping up in places like Brooklyn, Bronx, Queens, but also some in Manhattan. And this has various reasons why this has happened in this scale, I would say. One of them, you mentioned them. There's the population density, of course, making it a very interesting area to be in with your warehouses, especially for companies involved in e-commerce deliveries and e-commerce deliveries like Amazon, but also FedEx, UPS, and so on. So there's population, there's online buying, which has been strong for a while now, but especially with the pandemic has increased significantly. And then the zoning climate in New York has also made it quite easy for urban warehouses to be constructed because they're allowed to be developed there, which is not the case in all cities. But it has created a climate that's really interesting for real estate developers to start building warehouses in city centers.
And can you tell us a bit about the kind of warehouses that there are in New York City? Are we just talking about cross-dock operations, or what are the kind of operations that you're seeing?
Yeah, exactly. It's mostly focused on cross-docking. So really to assist the very last mile of of parcel deliveries, or last 50 feet almost. So really warehouses where you see a bunch of big trucks coming with totally filled with packages to be distributed immediately to smaller vehicles, vans mostly.
Because from time to time, you'll see photos on social media or articles in the local press complaining about vehicles being parked 3 abreast across the streets as parcels being transferred from one van to another. Is that sort of a reaction to, sorry, not a reaction to, but is that sort of part of this whole concept of the density of population, the volume of parcels? I think there's a huge volume of parcels that go through the city every day, aren't there?
Yeah, it's insane. If you want to see understand the sheer volume of e-commerce parcels these days, it's really interesting to go to a place like Manhattan. And one of the hypotheses that I had during doing this research is that, so in places like Brooklyn, for example, you have these urban warehouses now, which exist in these last mile activities. In places like Manhattan, you don't really. And so what you see is that the kind of the sorting almost and the last 50 feet activities are really happening on the curb. And so you see vans being unloaded, lots of parcels on the streets, on the curb, and then being placed into, for example, cargo bicycles to make these last deliveries. And I think from an urban planning perspective, but also from a good neighbor perspective, this is not exactly what you want. And so, because it takes up quite a lot of space, right? Interesting space that you could use for something else. And so this also kind of supports this idea of having a warehouse to do these cross-docking activities in areas where they're not as much of a nuisance as they are now.
One of the concepts that we've talked about a few times on the podcast is that the people who complain about e-commerce deliveries, vans blocking cycle lanes and vans being parked illegally and so on and so forth, are the same people who order online. They're the cause of their own problems. So that's a little bit harsh, but what I'm getting at here though is one of the concepts that you discuss in your paper is about community ignorance of the supply chain. I'm going to get to good neighbour in a moment, everybody. I know this is supposed to be the theme, is the good neighbour, but ignorance of the supply chain seems to be part of the friction between local residents and warehouses. Is that an accurate characterisation?
Yeah, well, you are right. That's also something I discuss in the paper. It's this whole e-commerce, the whole development around e-commerce has made it so easy for us to act as a citizen completely detached from our consumption behavior, how we act as a consumer. And so this becomes very clear with deliveries, right? Nobody wants to see trucks, and nobody feels like vans and trucks are in the right place when they are in residential areas, in their streets, creating safety hazards and so on, all kinds of things that people don't like. But they're bringing these parcels that they have ordered online and would like to receive at their houses, right? So it's a really interesting paradox. And I think we could do a bit more as well in explaining to people how this system of e-commerce functions.
Now, in your paper, you set out some best practices for becoming a good neighbour. And the first sentence is fantastic. It says, for urban warehouses to become good neighbours is not a straightforward endeavour. So, given that it's not a straightforward endeavour, can you share a couple of the findings from your research about how we can become good neighbours?
Yes. Yeah, well, exactly. So the whole idea of this paper was to really understand if we have these warehouses and if we like to have these warehouses, and for years, as urban logistics researchers and also some policymakers have been asking for this kind of facilities in urban areas because they assist in the sustainability transition, and we can talk about that a bit later. But so if we want them and if they are there, how can they be integrated in the urban fabric, in the urban core, in a way that is supported as well by people living and working in the same area? So really creating a sort of urban harmony as much as we can. And so I talked to a bunch of different people, real estate developers, people from the city, from different departments, from the regional area, also parcel delivery company representatives and so on. And so I came up with a number of best practices, as you say, that are kind of organized from a bigger scale to a very small scale. So on the bigger scale, you could think of what kind of the city in itself, what kind of what kind of environmental regulations have they put in place? Like if we would like to assist these urban warehouses in a transition towards more sustainable vehicles that are more adapted to the city, vehicles that are zero emission and so on, then it helps to have an urban-wide regulatory framework in place, all the way to how your streets need to accommodate not only the mobility of people, of workers, of neighbors, of people who live there and so on, who visit these areas, while also accommodating these bigger goods vehicles and creating a safe environment for that, all the way to how does your warehouse need to look, what kind of functions does it need to have, because in suburban areas we have these big boxes and they're only dedicated to logistics activities. When we place a warehouse in an urban area, it makes a lot more sense to think about how this building looks. If we could integrate other functions so that it becomes a building that is not only interesting from a logistics point of view, but also from a neighborhood point of view. Could we add retail functions, for example? And the architects that I talked to, they list all kinds of functions that could be really interesting for a warehouse to facilitate in this urban integration, such as technical schools, for example. They have no place to go right now, being pushed out of the city as well because they need so much space and so on. And so this could be a really interesting way of combining functions and creating an urban warehouse that can, in fact, become a good neighbor.
Talking about the environmental side of things, you briefly mentioned cargo bikes earlier, and one of the topics or one of the concepts that you mentioned in your paper is that of, I think it's called the eco-transfer. Can you just share a bit about what that concept is and how that fits into the idea of being a good urban neighbour?
Yeah, well, the concept of eco-transfers comes from a research from the team of Jose Olguenferas and Alison Conway. And so they've defined this system of eco-transfers as having an urban logistics facility that allows to have a consolidated supply of parcels, so a bigger truck that kind of supplies these urban logistics facilities. And then these parcels can be loaded onto vehicles that are more fit for the city. So environmentally friendly vehicles, smaller vehicles, and so on. So it's really this idea of having this facility and then using it to make this transition as well towards alternative vehicles, such as cargo bicycles, for example. And so this team published a really interesting study on this, really based on a number of indicators in New York City as well. They defined areas where these eco-transfers could be beneficial. And what's interesting to see is that in these areas that they have defined in this paper, based on data from a few years ago, we see now that indeed in these areas, a number of urban logistics facilities have been developed by the market now. So that's quite interesting to see, right? But that doesn't mean, unfortunately, that the crucial part of this system, these eco-transfers, these vehicles, these alternative vehicles, that this is actually happening. So this would be also, of course, one of the recommendations or best practices to use these facilities in the way that they could also create a shift towards alternative vehicles.
Another concept that you discuss in your paper is that of blocks and buffers. Now, for those of us who are involved in delivery, we're thinking, well, what does that really mean? Do I care? Well, maybe we do, because it's already being implemented in some parts of the world. I think it's the super block model in Barcelona, for example. But what does it mean? What do you mean when you talk about blocks and buffers? And then what does that mean for delivery?
Yeah. So this concept of blocks and buffers really comes down to the level all the way in between the urban level and then the building level. So it involves the streets surrounding this urban warehouse or the location where you want to implement this urban warehouse. And so this idea of blocks kind of refers to the super blocks model that is implemented by cities like Barcelona, for example. So it's a way of organizing different vehicle types, different modes of transportation. So in the super block model of Barcelona, you have around the block bigger transport or bigger vehicles are allowed. Within the block, the priority is given to smaller vehicles, like bicycles, for example, inside, and on the outside, you want your trucks, for example. So when investigating this concept or applying this concept to the urban warehouse, it's a similar way of thinking about priorities that should be given to certain type of vehicles, but it's not necessarily the same concept. It's about understanding where your transport goes that is related to the warehouse, and the transport that is related to all functions around the urban warehouse, and then prioritizing certain lanes for bigger transport, but then also prioritizing other lanes for the smaller transport. So kind of a way to organize it so you have a safe environment around your warehouse, even though you have vehicles of all sizes that are on the one hand attracted by or generated by this warehouse, but then also by the city and by the workers that go to this warehouse.
Heleen, we've got a few minutes left. I want to ask about why cities or local administration or anybody really should be interested in urban warehouses.
Yes, well, urban warehouses are interesting from different perspectives when we look at the environmental sustainability transition of cities. So first of all, we talked about this eco-transfer system, the way that we need these urban facilities to transition towards vehicles that are more adapted to the city. So if you would like to carry out your last 50 feet or your last mile transport with cargo bicycles, for example, you need an area to cross-dock these parcels from bigger vehicles to smaller vehicles, and urban warehouses are extremely fit for that. So, but also think about electrification there as well. You don't want to use your electric vehicle and the maybe limited range it has to cover a very big distance from a suburban warehouse to the urban core. So that's where urban warehouses come in. They're essential in this transition. But also when you have these urban warehouses, it means that all these delivery vehicles don't have to start their delivery route from a suburban location and then cover a big distance, which we call stem distance. When we have our urban warehouse, we can just supply in a consolidated way our warehouse, and in this way reduce transport distances as well. So there are quite some advantages to it in order to reduce the environmental impact of an e-commerce supply chain.
Heleen, how can people access your research and find out more about this concept of urban warehouses and being a good neighbour?
Well, it's published online in open access, so everybody can find the paper. If you would like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn as well. I posted the paper there as well, and you can contact me or reach out for more questions.
I will put a link to the research on the Postal Hub as well, so if you can't find it, you can just go to thepostalhub.com and find the research there. And you've got a special issue, Heleen, on this topic coming up soon. Is that right?
Yes. So for my fellow academics listening to this podcast, we have a special issue on urban logistics facilities coming up in a journal called Transportation Planning and Technology. I'm managing this special issue together with some colleagues, Bram Kien, Paul Buys, who has been on this podcast, and Laetitia Dablin, who has been on this podcast too. So all friends of the podcast. And so we're launching this special issue really to have a focused approach on everything that is sustainability impacts of urban logistics facilities, real estate implications, and also perspectives on urban planning.
So if anybody wants to find out more about that, just drop Heleen a line via LinkedIn or something like that. Heleen, is that the way to do it?
Yes, or you can send me an email as well.
I'll put links to all of that on thepostalhub.com. Search for the episode page on thepostalhub.com if you can't find Heleen on LinkedIn or wherever. Heleen Buldeo Rai, Assistant Professor at VUB, thank you very much for joining us on the Postal Hub podcast today.
Thank you for having me, Ian.
That's all for this episode of the Postal Hub podcast. Remember to subscribe to the podcast in your favourite podcast platform, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, whatever takes your fancy. While you're over there subscribing, please leave a rating, like 5 out of 5. That'd be nice. And even a little review. This is the highlight of your last mile week, or you're a postal nerd and you love it. I don't know. Just write something. It'd be helpful. Anyway. And then you can also, speaking of subscribe to the Postal Hub newsletter. It's a weekly newsletter that goes out with each episode. Or if you really like email, you can get my daily delivery digest that comes out every day. Well, not every day, like every work day. And includes all the headlines from around the delivery world. Go to thepostalhub.com and you'll find all of that and more over there. You can follow me on LinkedIn if you want to brighten up your LinkedIn world. Just search for Ian Kerr on LinkedIn and then click the follow button. I'm on Twitter, but I don't think it's called Twitter anymore. And I don't know. Don't bother about Twitter or whatever it's called this week. Just follow me on LinkedIn. What else? If you want to email me about anything at all, email me at ian@thepostalhub.com. I'm Ian Kerr. Thanks for listening in, and I look forward to your company next time on the Postal Hub podcast.